From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Clinical Reviews, interviews and ideas about innovations in medicine, science, and clinical practice.
Welcome to listeners from around the world, and thank you for tuning in to this JAMA Clinical Review podcast. I am your host, Mary McDermott, Deputy Editor of JAMA, and I'm here today with Dr. John Ravits, a neurologist at UC San Diego Health, professor of clinical neurosciences at UC San Diego School of Medicine, and head of ALS translational research at UC San Diego School of Medicine. Dr. Ravits is author of a JAMA review on the topic of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Ravits.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I'd like to get started with having you tell us what is ALS and how common is it?
ALS is a rare adult-onset neurodegenerative disease, which is characterized by progressive muscle weakness. It's a degeneration of the motor neurons controlling movement, and so the manifestation is weakness.
And what are the typical presenting symptoms? What type of weakness, for example?
So the key characteristic is weakness. It can begin actually in any of the muscles of the body. So it can start with problems with speech, slurred speech, problems of weakness in the arm or the hand or in the leg. And it typically begins in just a very specific area and then spreads to other muscle areas nearby.
And how quickly does that spreading happen?
Well, the onset is insidious, so usually it's a matter of 3 to 6 months before patients even are aware that there's a pathologic problem. It's oftentimes attributed to disuse or lack of exercise or written off for other reasons. So 3 to 6 months, sometimes longer, before patients become aware of the problem. And it typically progresses over about a 3 to 5 year period of time.
Who is at risk for ALS? What is the typical patient's age, sex, other characteristics?
Well, the average age is between 55 and 65. Males are predominant, it's about 60% male, 40% females. There is a genetic form of it, which we can talk about, and that's generally a little bit younger, about age 55 onset. And then that would be equal male and female.
Yes. Will your review discusses sporadic and familial ALS? Can you talk a little bit about that and how that relates to genetics and why those two forms are important to distinguish?
Sure. The genetics, we realize now, is about 15% of the ALS population has usually an autosomal dominant pattern of inheritance, and then about 85% is sporadic. The familial has led the research because once you have the mystery with ALS is what's causing it and what are the molecular mechanisms. So with the genes, we now have handles to bring that into models, and it's opened up the research. It also has implications for family management because if a member's been identified with the genetic form, then it has implications for all the first-degree relatives.
Do you recommend that all of those first-degree relatives be tested?
Well, that's a changing practice. It used to be that since it wasn't actionable, it was not encouraged. But more and more, I think patients are asking if they should be tested, if they want to be tested. It becomes a personal decision. But I think more and more patients' families are interested in knowing their status.
And for the familial form, what proportion of first-degree relatives, if tested, would test positive?
Approximately 50%. If they're a direct relative, since it's a dominant inheritance, they would be 50% risk.
Do we know much about the pathophysiology of ALS? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, the biggest breakthrough in trying to understand the mechanisms came in 2006 with the identification of a protein called TDP-43. Very little was known about it at the time, but it's opened up the research field. The TDP is a protein that has a lot of nuclear function, so it's mainly a nuclear protein, but it shuttles back and forth. And in ALS, what we see in the neuropathology is that the nucleus is cleared and the TDP protein has aggregated in the cytoplasm. So the research has really focused on why is that happening.
A little bit ago, you mentioned that the typical presenting symptoms might be a focal weakness or a speech difficulty that's new and gradually progresses. If such a patient comes in to see, say, a primary care physician, what would they want to look for on physical exam that supports an ALS diagnosis?
Great question. ALS is very rare. So most of the patients who have problems with weakness will have other problems related to pinched nerves, to muscle problems, nerve root problems. But what we see with the ALS patient is that it has mixed characteristics. It can have the characteristic of what we call upper motor neuron degeneration. And at the same time, we see characteristics of lower motor neuron degeneration. And they're each clinically recognized. The upper motor neuron degeneration usually has slowed, incoordinated movements that are spastic, and there's hyperreflexia, whereas the lower motor neuron degeneration creates atrophy, fasciculations, muscle twitching, flaccidity, and a loss of reflex. So typically what we see is these two coexisting in the same limb.
Wow, that's interesting. So you could either see hypo or hyperreflexia.
That's correct. An example would be somebody has weakness, atrophy, twitching, fasciculations in the arm, that arm has pathologic increase of reflexes, which indicates that there's upper motor neuron degeneration at the same time.
Let's say a patient with ALS comes in presenting for the first time to primary care, and the clinician feels they need to do some diagnostic testing. What diagnostic testing would you recommend?
Well, the findings depend on where the weakness is occurring. So typically, if it's a problem of speech and swallowing, the MRI scanning of the brain would be the most relevant. If the problem is in the leg, usually spinal imaging, the lumbar spine, even up into the thoracic and cervical spine. So the neurologists typically focus right into the relevant anatomic area. Imaging is really the most critical.
And what would one find supporting a diagnosis of ALS on those imaging studies?
The imaging is negative. So the imaging is done to exclude other mimicking causes. An example would be a spinal cord compression, a stroke, a brain tumor, something like that that's creating the problem.
And what is the role of neurodiagnostic testing like nerve conduction velocity and EMG?
That's where we generally will make the diagnosis. EMG is a test. It really consists of two major components, nerve conduction studies, and then the electromyography is the needle examination of the muscle physiology. What we typically see is normal nerve conduction studies. There's no pinched nerve, there's no nerve compression, but there is evidence of denervation and reinnervation in a number of muscles. And that indicates that there's an ongoing problem of the innervating neurons.
Your review talks about this is rather a diagnosis of exclusion. So somebody has typical presenting signs and symptoms, and you do these other tests. And for the most part, well, at least they're not specific. What are other diseases in the differential diagnosis that should be excluded that you haven't mentioned?
But the typical path for a patient who's presenting with progressive weakness is from the primary care, oftentimes then referred to a neurologist. And then the neurologist will do a number of tests, but then frequently will then in turn refer to an ALS specialist if they begin to suspect that it's ALS. Some of the mimicking problems can be other neurodegenerative diseases. There's Parkinson's-like diseases that can sometimes be mistaken. It's called progressive supranuclear palsy or multiple system atrophy. There's a number of rare degenerative diseases. Sometimes for the lower motor neuron, neuromuscular, it can be a muscle problem, polymyositis, or inclusion body myopathy, myasthenia gravis, a disease of the neuromuscular junction, can cause weakness and speech problems and so on.
So ultimately, after ruling out those other conditions, the diagnosis is made. Is that correct?
Yeah, the diagnosis is made usually on the duality of the coexistence of upper and lower motor neuron, the progression over time, and the spread from up the arm to the other arm, and so the spread of the weakness. And ultimately, ALS is a clinical diagnosis. Once the diagnosis is made, then frequently genetic testing is also done to exclude genetic causes. But the gene testing doesn't verify the diagnosis, it just further defines the specifics in the ALS patient.
And what is the typical prognosis?
Well, the prognosis overall is progressive and fatal in about 3 to 5 years. But that's one of the challenges that the clinicians have is once the diagnosis is made is trying to more individualize the progression. There are patients who have very insidious progression, 5 to 10 years or longer, and then there are patients who can progress more rapidly.
Are there factors that predict whether it will be a slower or faster progression?
Not well understood. What is modifying the progression is, for the most part, not known. We know that some of the genetic mutations are particularly rapid in that same gene. Other mutations might be more slow. So it's not clear what is modifying the progression rates.
Let's talk about treatment. Your review talks about 3 medications that are FDA approved for ALS. Can you talk about those 3 medicines, please?
Yes, sure. The oldest medicine is a drug called riluzole, which was approved in the 1990s. It's a glutamate inhibitor. It has been around a long time. We know that its effects are very modest. The general rule is that it adds 2 to 4 months of life. More recent meta-analyses have indicated that perhaps the magnitude of the improvement's better, 4 to 6 months. The effects are basically just taken on faith. There's no way to measure whether the drug is doing what it's supposed to do, and you can't really ascertain in any one individual what the effects are going to be. The second drug that was approved more recently was within the last 5 years is a drug called Darivone, which is an antioxidant. And that has shown that if treated early in the high-functioning patients, that it also has a modest benefit, perhaps 4 to 6 months. And that was approved in the United States, and it's available in Canada, but the Europeans have tested it and didn't believe that it has any effect, and so it was not approved in the UK or the European Union. And the third drug that has more recently been approved is a drug called tofersen, which is a completely new approach to molecular mechanisms focused with a gene mutation. So this drug is a drug that reduces the expression of a gene called SOD1, which is one of the more common genetic causes. And so it's given intrathecally, so by a lumbar puncture, and it reduces the production of the SOD1 protein, and that's proved to be very beneficial. Some of the testing we think has underestimated the benefits, and so as the experience progresses, we're finding more and more benefit over long term, and we're even starting to see improvement in up to about 25% of the patients. That's interestingly also now, since it's actionable for SOD1 mutation, that's one of the reasons for having genetic testing in first-degree relatives, because if they're at risk, then we're pretty confident that earlier intervention is going to be better.
And then your review talks about interventions to improve ALS symptoms such as dysphagia, dysarthria, respiratory compromise, nutrition. Can you talk about that a little bit, please?
One of the major advances that we've made in the ALS field has been in the support of patients, and this has been evolving and improving since the 1990s over the last, say, 20, 25 years in terms of organizing multidisciplinary care, because it's such a rare disease and the problems are so specific to each patient, whether it's speech or swallowing, respiratory, arm function, mobility. We've organized into teams that will deliver multidisciplinary care proactively. So we see the patients approximately every 3 months, reassess all of these functions: speech, swallowing, nutrition, respirations, activities of daily living, and mobility. And we work with them to then support with whatever may be required.
What about some of the novel therapies for difficulty with communication, Can you talk about that?
Yes, about 2/3 of the patients will then progress at some point during the disease, either early or late, into problems with speech and communications. And there's a number of things we can do. One of them is voice banking. So early, when the patients have normal speech, the speech therapist will assess and bank their voice. And then with computer simulations later, if it's needed, then they can use augmentative communications such as computers and other assistive devices to then reproduce their voice.
And then what about your review talks about the timing of nutritional evaluation, say for a G tube, given the respiratory compromise that is so common?
Yes, we follow closely in the clinics two particular parameters. We follow all of the functions, but one is their weight and the other is their respiratory capacity. Typically would start out at 100%, but that can be affected earlier or later, and it's at different stages with different patients. But that's important not only in itself, but if they're having weight loss, we want to then intervene with G tubes when their respiratory capacity can handle the procedure. So the move has been more early intervention for G tube placement.
Mhm. Thank you so much. This has been a really informative discussion. I'm wondering if there anything that we didn't cover that you would like to add today?
Well, I think one of the exciting things in the field has been in the research arena and really trying to understand the mechanisms underneath this disease with the belief that if we can identify those, we can really establish a fundamental treatment for the disease. And because the progression is so observable and they're so oftentimes willing to take chances, clinical trials and drug development has been especially active in the field around the world.
I'm Mary McDermott, and I've been speaking today with Dr. John Ravits about his JAMA review on the topic of ALS. You can find a link to the article in this episode's description. This episode was produced by Daniel Musisi at the JAMA Network. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, please visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com or search for JAMA Network wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.
This content is protected by copyright by the American Medical Association with all rights reserved, including those for text and data mining, AI training, and similar technologies.